This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The News Hour with Ian Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 7 on LBC. I'm Ian Dale, back in the studio in Westminster, back from Manchester, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and also dog-tired. Now, the News Hour headlines. Boris Johnson promises to get on with the job of uniting and levelling up the UK in his speech to the Conservative Party conference. The £20 universal credit uplift comes to an end today as gas prices hit a record high. And in a major breakthrough that could save millions of lives worldwide, the WHO recommends broad use of the world's first malaria vaccine.
The News Hour with Ian Dale. This is LBC.
The Prime Minister has promised to fix weaknesses in the economy and attempted to lay out what he means by levelling up during his speech at the Conservative Party conference today. In a typically upbeat address, peppered with jokes but light on new policy, Boris Johnson insisted a high-wage, high-skilled economy was being created in the wake of Brexit and the pandemic. With worker shortages and concerns over fuel access dominating the headlines in recent weeks, he was resolute in his determination to fix it.
The answer to the present stresses and strains, which are mainly a function of growth and economic revival, is not to reach for that same old lever of uncontrolled immigration, to keep wages low. The answer is to control immigration, to allow people of talent to come to this country, but not to use immigration as an excuse for failure to invest in people, in skills, and in the equipment, the facilities, the machinery. Or in the machinery, the facilities they need to do their jobs. The truck stops, to pick an example entirely at random, with basic facilities where you don't have to urinate in the bushes. And that is the direction in which this country is going now, towards a high-wage, high-skill, high productivity, and yes, thereby a low-tax economy.
Well, inevitably, of course, at the heart of the speech was the so-called levelling up agenda.
We have one of the most imbalanced societies and lopsided economies of all the richer countries. It's not just that there's a gap between London and the southeast and the rest of the country. There are aching gaps within the regions themselves. What monkey glands are they applying in Ribble Valley? What royal jelly are they eating that they live 7 years longer than the people of Blackpool, only 33 miles away? Why does half of York's population boast a degree and only a quarter of Doncaster's? That is not just a question of social justice. It is an appalling waste of potential, and it is holding this country back.
Well, Ben Kentish is LBC's Westminster correspondent. He spent the week in Manchester and was in the hall for Boris Johnson's speech, as was I. You may have seen me on television looking rather miserable. I spoke to Ben just before we came on air. So, Ben, it's been a strange kind of conference in that there was no news that emerged from it really all week, which the Conservatives might think, well, job done then. But it was, I think, one of Boris Johnson's better speeches. I've been quite critical in the past of his. It was certainly the 2019 conference speech that he made, but I thought this one was rather different.
Ian, it was upbeat, it was optimistic, it was bombastic, it was packed full of Boris Johnson-style jokes and quips. Nobody could doubt, I don't think, the scale of the ambition, the boldness of the agenda that Boris Johnson has laid out. He wants to transform, to use his words, the underlying issues that he said consecutive governments had not had the guts to tackle. And he went through some of them: investing in transport, fixing the housing crisis, fixing social care, rolling out high-speed broadband across the UK. These are all big policies. There's two risks for him here, really. The first is the cost. It all costs a lot of money to do all of that. He warned his party, really, that tax rises are inevitable in order to fund it and in order to start to pay off some of the debt that was accrued during the COVID pandemic. He said that Margaret Thatcher would not have allowed debt to spiral in that way. Talked about COVID being a meteorite that had hit the public finances. He was warning his party that when it comes to tax policy, there are things that may need to be done that they may not like. The second risk is simply that, the scale of it. We are at most only 2.5 years away from the next general election. Some MPs on both sides of the Commons think it could be a year earlier than that. The risk for Boris Johnson is that he lays out these vast, sweeping, grand, ambitious plans, and when it comes to the general election, people say, you've had 5 years, okay, perhaps COVID took away 18 months or so of them. I don't feel my life's that different. Yes, you might talk about all these historic changes, but they're going to take 10 years, 20 years. What have you done for me? And there are Conservative MPs, Conservative members I was speaking to, who are a little bit concerned about the sort of tangibility, how much people will feel the changes in the next 2 years above and beyond this sort of long-term plan that Boris Johnson has. However, what I suspect they may end up doing is saying, look, here's what we've done so far. We've got this bold vision. Give us another 5 years to implement it. And it is tricky, given the scale of that levelling up agenda, for Labour to work out exactly how to combat it, how to approach it, because really, Ian, Boris Johnson was warning his party there may be things that they don't like, because the agenda effectively is one that Keir Starmer wouldn't necessarily disagree with. He will criticise Boris Johnson's ability to enact it. He will criticise the detail. But when it comes to things like investing in transport, building more houses, increasing the number of hospitals, improving schools, that's something that no politician is likely to oppose. So it is a tricky one for Labour.
We got a lot of the what, we got less of the how. Does that matter?
Not at this stage. Not at this stage. This was about, number 10 said, resetting the agenda, reminding voters that levelling up plan that won him the 2019 general election was still their priority, despite the fact that, of course, it'd been blown off course by the COVID pandemic. That was the point of this speech. So I think at the moment, the fact there was effectively very little new, very little policy, only one real announcement, very little detail, in fact, on exactly how and when and how it would be funded. It wasn't designed to do that. However, those questions are going to come to the fore quite quickly. And Ian, they're going to come to the fore particularly if the sort of crises, the perfect storm of crises, as some MPs see it, does start to bite this winter. Shortages, increases in the cost of energy, universal credit being cut, unavailability of goods and workers in the coming weeks and months. Those things will lead people, some MPs, Conservative MPs, fear to start saying, okay, you've got this big plan, you've got the optimism, you've got all the rhetoric. What are you doing about these issues?
Where's the beef?
Because it's all well and good saying, well, I'm going to give you high-speed broadband across the country. If people can't get petrol or they can't buy their food for Christmas in, the pressure is going to get much, much more significant on Boris Johnson, not in the long term, because that will be slightly overridden by the fact that there are these short-term pressures that the demand for him to tackle will significantly increase.
We're at the end of the conference season now. There was a big contrast, I thought, between Boris Johnson's speech and Keir Starmer's last week. If you're the leader of the opposition, it's always a really tricky position, isn't it? Because you've got to try and give some sort of degree of optimism, but you're also essentially saying, well, things are terrible at the moment and we're all going to hell in a handcart. And that doesn't go down necessarily well with the electorate. And of course, Boris Johnson is the antithesis of that. He just has this, I mean, some people call it boosterism. I didn't think there was actually a lot of that. It was an optimistic speech, absolutely. But where do you see the two leaders and the parties at the end of the conference season?
Well, I think they've both come out of their conferences at least unscathed, Ian, and perhaps emboldened. Certainly in Keir Starmer's case, had a good conference. I think he came out of that week in a stronger position, both in the eyes of the public and when it comes to internal party management than he went into it. Boris Johnson dominated the whole conference. If anyone doubted before that this was a Prime Minister in complete control of his party, and indeed, Ian, I would suggest completely loving the job he is doing. I think these stories about him not enjoying it and being wanting to stand down in a year or two are completely false from what I can understand. He's strengthened too, but as I say, the devil will be in the next few months. Really, conference season, I don't think it would have changed the polls significantly. It doesn't change the picture. Boris Johnson has set out this big vision. Keir Starmer, as you absolutely rightly say, now has to work out how to combat it. I think if he's sensible, he won't try to combat it because, to be honest, there's not a lot in it that he will disagree with. He will try to draw lines when it comes to things like competence. Yes, Boris Johnson can promise all this. What is he delivering? And depict himself, as he did a bit last week, as the serious statesman-like politician, in contrast to the language he used last week, was jovial Boris Johnson. Today, Labour calling the Prime Minister's speech trivial. These are vacuous, These are the sorts of words that they're using already. That's a sign of the sort of arguments they will be making to criticise Boris Johnson, the leader, because I think at the moment they're finding it difficult to criticise his plan for the country because, frankly, as I say, it's not too dissimilar from what they would do too.
LBC Westminster correspondent Ben Kentish. Well, one Conservative MP who will be hoping Boris Johnson's rhetoric cuts through is Jill Mortimer. She was recently elected Conservative MP for Hartlepool, and she joins us now. Jill, very good evening.
Good evening.
Now, your constituency is part of what was previously known as the Red Wall. Do you think the Prime Minister's talk is what's needed to turn the rest of the Red Wall blue?
Well, I think the rest of the Red Wall will turn blue because the people in the rest of the wall are like the people in my constituency, and they're not daft, and they know a good thing when they see it.
What did you learn from Boris Johnson's speech today that you didn't know before about what he plans to do about levelling up? Because there was a lot of what, but not much how, a lot of aspiration, but not much detail on how he was going to achieve his ambitions.
Well, you must have been listening to a slightly different speech to me, because one thing that I took away today was this extra £3,000 that we're going to put into teachers' salary premium. Now, for me in Hartlepool, that's fantastic news, because when you look at one of the biggest reasons that, the obstacles for levelling up, it's about skills, it's about adult skills, and it's also about maths and English for our kids. And I think that, we've got a real good chance of attracting and retaining good teachers in my schools in Hartlepool, and recognising the achievement that they're going to make there. You've got to realise that disadvantaged schools are more likely to face teacher supply issues. So this news, this targeted extra cash for teachers in the right places, is going to cause an awful lot, to make levelling up happen.
I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that, but that was the only new policy that he announced in his whole speech. And I mean, good news though it is, it's not exactly a mega policy, is it?
Well, I think you've got to start somewhere, and education to me is a mega policy. I mean, what about the things with continuing support for the film restart scheme? Are you saying that 34,000 jobs aren't important in the film industry that we're supporting? There were lots of things in the speech. And I think what you've got to remember, strong leadership charts a direction. And that is what the Prime Minister did for us today. He showed us the way we're going. We know what levelling up means. It means creating opportunity. And the minutiae of how we do that will come in the following weeks.
Well, it's got to come in the following weeks, hasn't it? Because if you leave it too long, the next general election might be in autumn 2023. Some people are suggesting that's not an awful long time for your constituents and others in the Red Wall seats to actually say, well, yeah, I have noticed the difference. We have been levelled up here, and I can point to X, Y and Z in my area where I can see a real difference. Now, if they aren't able to see those differences by the time of the next election, you'll be in trouble, won't you?
Well, that's why I'm working hard every day for my constituents to make sure that I bring investment into my constituency. There's so much that I've got to get on with, and that's what I'm doing every day. I'll be back in my office 7 o'clock tomorrow morning getting on with the job.
George on Twitter says, Hartlepool, the town with the highest unemployment rate in England. Is that true?
We don't have the highest unemployment rate in England. We've got problems with employment, but you've got to remember that unemployment now is at the lowest levels that we've had in decades. And that's down to our vaccination programme, and getting people, back into work is very, very important. And that's what I will be doing in Hartlepool.
Got another text here from you're attracting the text, Jill, which is very good. James in Canterbury says, as a Tory voter, I need to know, will I be levelled up or levelled down? If I'm going to lose, I want to know. I live in the southeast and there are a huge amount of people up north who are better off than me. I'm fed up with this rhetoric. And I think that reflects a wider view of some people in the south, and particularly maybe in London, who think, well, hang on a minute, we subsidise the rest of the country, but to the tune of £38 billion a year. What about us? We should be getting some of that money back.
Listen, there's an old saying, a rising tide floats all ships. And the people in the south need to see that the prosperity of the country as a whole is better when everybody's doing well. We're going to take, you're going to take pressure away from their services down there by spreading things out, by spreading the population. At the moment, in the north, we're losing our brightest and our best south. We want to retain those people in our towns where they belong with their families. So we want to provide the jobs there. And this isn't stealing jobs. This is creating new jobs. This is creating new jobs in our new green industrial revolution. We're going to have things like hydrogen, production. There's so many things going on. People in the South really should not be afraid. This isn't about levelling them down. The only people who level down are the Labour Party. We're levelling everybody up.
Well, you're not levelling up people on universal credit, are you? Because they're losing £20 a week from today.
Right, the universal credit issue, we gave out universal credit to support people. The extra £20 uplift was a grant. It was a temporary grant given to support people through the pandemic. In the same way, there was a furlough scheme, there was mortgage support, there were lots of things put in place. It was always temporary. Now, if we keep that, it wasn't targeted, everybody on universal credit got it. If we keep that, that's going to cost £6 billion. Now, where are we going to pay for that? You're going to tax people, you're going to borrow it. The money we've got, we need to invest to create jobs. The way to get people off universal credit is to get them onto high-skilled, high-wage jobs. And the people who, will really struggle, who are always going to struggle, we've got extra money. We're putting in £500 million to support the poorer families.
Jill, thank you very much for talking to us. That's Jill Mortimer, Conservative MP for Hartlepool. Coming up, we'll get the reaction from Labour to Boris Johnson's speech. It's
Ian Dale on LBC.
It is 22 minutes past 7. Well, there wasn't much policy in the Prime Minister's speech this morning, but he did announce a plan to encourage talented maths and science teachers to work in disadvantaged areas.
There is absolutely no reason why the kids of this country should lag behind, or why so many should be unable to read or write or do basic mathematics at 11. And to level up, on top of the extra 14 billion we're putting into education, on top of the increase that means every teacher starts with a salary of £30,000, we're announcing today a levelling up premium of up to £3,000 to send the best maths and science teachers to the places that need them most.
Kate Green is Shadow Education Secretary and Labour MP for Stratford and Emerson, and she joins us now. Kate, very good evening. I imagine there's a lot in the Prime Minister's speech that you would disagree with, but what about that particular announcement?
Well, it's really woefully inadequate, Ian. I mean, 2 years ago, the government announced a retention premium to try to attract and keep teachers in subjects where there were shortages and in disadvantaged areas. Last year, they cancelled that. This year, they're reinstating it again. But under the Conservatives, we've got double the teacher vacancies that we had 10 years ago. This £30,000 starting salary has been promised, but still not delivered. Teachers are still £4,000 worse off in real terms on average than in 2010. And I have to say that what the Prime Minister announced earlier today falls far short of Labour's own commitment to invest in professional development for teachers and school leaders and to immediately move to fill vacancies and create 6,500 new teaching posts.
So is it your policy to give maths and science teachers more than £3,000 a year to move into these disadvantaged areas?
Well, I think it's about having a range of policies that invest in teachers, invest in their professional development, ensure that they are supported if they go to work in the more challenging schools. At the moment, there's no real incentive for a teacher to go to a school where they think that Ofsted may penalise their efforts, mark them down. And that's why we've said we want to reform Ofsted. And we also think it is really important that the teacher pay is adequate. But that isn't actually the thing that teachers raise most, to be honest, Ian. The thing they talk about most is the stress of their workload, the intensity of their workload, and the fact that they face the biggest workload challenge of any teachers in Europe. And we've got to support their professional activities and development.
But you haven't answered my question. Would you offer more than £3,000?
I'm saying what we would offer is a range of support, including the investment in their long-term career prospects, and
but would you offer them a premium to move to
vacancies? Those are
would you offer a premium
for both teachers and for levelling up?
Would you offer a premium for teachers to move to disadvantaged schools?
I don't think
it's a simple yes or no.
Well, I think it's very important to diagnose the problem correctly, to recognise that the government itself has been stop-go on premiums, and that what is important is that we have the right package of support to not just attract teachers to certain schools, but to keep them there. And I don't believe that we've got any policy from the government that will do that.
OK, so it's a no. Let me just read you a blog post comment, which I wouldn't normally do, but I think this is quite interesting. I wrote an article on Boris Johnson's speech earlier on my website. It's on the LBC website if people want to look at it too. And it's from Les. He left this comment 3 hours ago. He says, I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool Tory. In fact, I'm a disaffected Labour voter for my whole adult life who only looked to tick blue in 2019. However, for all his foibles, of which there are many, I like and trust Boris with the job at hand. I watched with interest to see what he had to say, and I must say I really liked it. His positivity is the most impressive. To me, he genuinely sees a positive future for us in the country, and that really matters a lot to me, and I guess many others. I agree with him on jobs. You see the tax increase, immigration, even if it's very hard to see through, and his handling of Brexit. He always leaves me with hope. I don't think he'll achieve everything he wants for us, but at least he tries to go forward, which sadly every other party leader just don't possess. A positive and inspiring speech, in my view. Now, doesn't that encapsulate the problem that the Labour Party has got, where Les, who's been a lifetime Labour voter, is actually rather impressed by Boris Johnson?
I think it does encapsulate the challenge, Ian. I think that's a very fair point. And I think it's a point that Keir Starmer himself has recognised and has been talking a lot about the conversations he's been having over this summer with people who voted Labour in the past, who perhaps are thinking about whether they might want to come back to Labour but aren't there yet, and who perhaps do like the optimism and enthusiasm that they think they're seeing from the Prime Minister. But, you know, actions have to be matched with words. And we are going into this winter with rising inflation, sharply rising inflation, a cost of living crisis, uncertainty about whether we're going to have stocks on the shelves this Christmas. We know that we've got pigs being slaughtered because we haven't got spaces in abattoirs, workforce shortages in the heavy goods vehicle sector, and we are still, of course, not really out of the COVID crisis. Our infection rates remain high, and the NHS faces continuing pressures. So enthusiasm is all very well. Ambition and optimism, absolutely. It's what Labour feels for our country and for our future. But it's got to be matched with delivery. And I do feel we're going into a winter where increasingly that enthusiasm is going to display itself as hollow.
Kate, thank you very much for joining us. That's Kate Green, the Shadow Education Secretary. Now, wholesale gas prices hit a record high in the UK today due to a combination of the huge global demand and reduced supply. Prices then went down again as Russia's President Vladimir Putin announced his country would boost supplies to Europe. So is Russia here to save the day? There's a question. And might all this affect prices for you at home? Linda Yu is a fellow in economics at the University of Oxford, and she joins us now. Linda, very good evening. Now, I think I'm right in saying that we have less of a reliance on Russian gas than other European countries. What does this move from Vladimir Putin mean today, particularly for us?
Well, I think it means that, let's see, because first thing we should say is he's made this promise, and it looks like he's trying to influence a decision on a pipeline called Nord Stream 2. So there's a bit of geopolitics there, but obviously any increase in supply would help dampen global prices, and that would help us because part of our energy crisis, as you said, there's a number of factors, but one of the factors is that global prices are so high, and that's contributing to high prices that we're experiencing here.
So over the course of the next few weeks, I was seeing that Martin Lewis from Money Saving Expert, he's urging people not to switch their energy supplier at the moment because the prices, the rates that they will get will be so uncompetitive. It looks as though the average annual bill will go up from £1,100 to £1,700 a year if you switch now. How do you see this developing over the next few months?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's really quite uncertain, but National Grid, so this is the company that has overarching responsibility for our national electricity and gas systems in England, Wales, and Scotland. The CEO says it's going to be tight, but he doesn't expect shortages during the winter. And I think he's pointing specifically to getting alternative supplies from Norway and elsewhere. So one of the factors that's disrupted our gas supplies is an interconnector. So there was a fire in this important it's literally called the interconnector, Ian, between us and France. There was a fire there, and that contributed again to this. So by the end of the year, he thinks that this could be that part of it could be replaced. Now, that's not the whole story, as we all know, because global prices we've already discussed. And another big factor is the green transition. So the fact that we shut down coal-fired power plants and moved more to renewables Wind power is at the lowest in the 1960s. There just isn't a lot of global wind. And nuclear power, which supplies about 20% of our energy, those are being shut down. And there's only one new nuclear power plant, which is being built. So what I'm suggesting is it's going to be tight going into the winter. And all of these other factors suggest that it may actually be with us through next year.
Linda, thank you. That's Linda Yu, Fellow in Economics at the University of Oxford. Coming up at 8, it's Cross Question. My LBC colleague Andrew Pearce will be joining us, Miata Fambule from the New Economics Foundation, Councillor David Rodwell, who is the leader of Barking and Dagenham Council, and Olivia Utley, Assistant Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. 0345 6060 973. The lines are open for that now.
Ian Dale on LBC.
It's 7:35 on LBC. It's high time that we had a business roundup with Andy Sylvester, editor of City AM. Andy, very good evening. Now, business not too impressed with Boris Johnson today.
No, indeed. Yesterday, Ian, we spoke about the fact that if there wasn't a bit of love to the business community in the Prime Minister's speech today, the comments that were coming out would involve words like complacency and time to get with the programme. And that's exactly what has happened. Businesses saying, well, they welcome the vision of a high-wage, high-skilled economy, and frankly, most of them do. They'd like to get there. An awful lot of them saying that the PM's speech just didn't really, for them, tally with their lived experiences. That was a direct quote from the Federation of Small Businesses. Tax hikes, energy cost increases, inflation, right across the board. And I think businesses were hoping for a little more appreciation of the fact that life is hard out there and they are trying hard. And while they might want to get to this sunlit upland that the Prime Minister describes, a little bit of appreciation and a little bit of help to get there would have been appreciated.
Well, by coincidence, I was sitting next to the head of the CBI, Tony Danker, on the train back from Manchester. I did invite him on tonight, but he thought it was probably best not. Now, what else are we going to talk about? Tesco, they're confident they can ride out the shortages.
Yeah, indeed. Sales and profits grew faster than expected at Britain's biggest supermarket. They managed to shrug off the pandemic impact. They are warning that there are labour shortages, but Tesco, probably more than any other supermarket, has invested an awful lot of cash in logistics and supply chain management. So they're confident that they will be able to ride out the shortages. They did warn that there are some concerns around customers panic buying, which could sort of trigger shortages, or at least shortages on the shelves, even if there aren't actually shortages around drivers and items. So the moral of the story from Tesco's results today is, A, if you can own a large supermarket, you should, and B, if you're a customer, don't go buying your turkey just yet. You'll only make it harder for the rest of us.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. That's Andy Sylvester, editor of City AM.
LBC Business Update.
With Direct Line Business Insurance. Tailor your insurance to your business so you only pay for what you need.
JC in Blackheath is not happy with me. It says, Ian, you wasted no time last week with Starmer's conference speech describing it as lacking coherence. But with Johnson's speech lacking any credibility, you described it as one of the best speeches he's made. Positivity, you never bothered to read out my text, so I'm not expecting any response. That's LBC for you. I won't get your response, but I probably won't hang around to listen. Well, I've read out your text now, so I hope you were listening. Look, I give my honest views. I genuinely didn't think that Keir Starmer's speech was one of his better ones last week. I accept that other people take a different view. I was critical of Boris Johnson's 2019 conference speech because I thought it did lack coherence. This one, I didn't. So I've said so. That's what I'm here to do, isn't it? Rob Harris is global sports writer for the Associated Press. He's here with our sports roundup, obviously. Rob, very good evening. Now, Newcastle developments. This is interesting.
It is. I'd say no mention of the conference speech in terms of Boris Johnson's reference to, did Brexit help to see off the Super League? Well, that's been challenged. But Sport Tonight does merge.
Even I wouldn't claim that.
No, certainly Gary Lineker speaking out on that as well. He's decided to wade back into Brexit politics, he said, after 2 years on Twitter today as a result of hearing that. But maybe we'll be quiet again. But certainly the sport is merging with business news tonight, because potentially we could see the Saudi takeover of Newcastle back on. One of the key impediments to that takeover going through, and it was indeed stalled last year, was a very complex situation involving Saudi Arabia being accused by the World Trade Organization of facilitating the piracy of broadcast rights from Qatari-owned beIN Sports, and those broadcasts include of the Premier League, and it's something the Premier League had protested against to even US trademark authorities to try to clamp down on this piracy operation in the Saudi kingdom. Well, when the Saudi Private Investment Fund in 2020 launched a £300 million bid for Newcastle, the Premier League couldn't approve the potential new owners and directors of Newcastle, in part because of their challenges over the piracy. But today, we're now hearing that the Saudis have informed beIN, the Qatari broadcaster, that they will no longer be banned in Saudi Arabia, and they're stopping piracy operations. So potentially this could clear the path to a Newcastle takeover by the private investment fund, which is ultimately a Saudi sovereign wealth fund overseen by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And this had even in recent weeks reached arbitration cases, and in fact Newcastle had taken to the Premier League to a case saying that the PIF, the investment fund, shouldn't be considered part of the Saudi state. But of course, bin Salman is ultimately in control of it. So it could be something that rapidly moves with quite a complex takeover scenario.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. That's Rob Harris, global sports writer for the Associated Press. Now, it's been 10 days since Germany's general election, and things are looking good for Olaf Scholz and the Social Democrats. The Greens and the Liberals have agreed to start exploratory talks with the SPD. They could be the kingmakers. So how close is Mr. Scholz to being Chancellor? Well, Stephanie Bolton is London correspondent for Die Welt, and she joins us now. Stephanie, very good to have you on the programme again. Now, why is it taking so long? Because David Cameron and Nick Clegg, they sorted out a coalition agreement within a few days. This looks as if it could drag on to near Christmas.
I actually think it's rather quick. It's only been 10 days, as you said, since the election, and they are already going into exploratory talks. That doesn't mean they really talk about a coalition agreement, but at least they want to sit together tomorrow morning in Berlin at 10 o'clock, the first time that the SPD, the Liberals and the Greens will sit together. Back in 2010, that was a very different situation, because the Tories, while they had missed an absolute majority, but they were clearly the big player in this. And now you have three parties who more or less got the same amount of votes. So it's more eye to eye than it was back in the days in the Rose Garden.
What are the problems likely to be? Will it be the Greens demanding the finance ministry?
Yeah, one thing is really the FDP, the Liberals, and it's important to say the Liberals in Germany are very different to the Lib Dems in the UK. They're very pro-business, low tax, maybe a bit like the libertarian wings of the Tories. So they want the finance minister. The Greens want the finance minister because they want to fund the fight against climate change. And there are other things like, for example, rising taxes to pay for the fight against climate change. That's something that the Greens want and the SPD also want, and the FDP, the Liberals, definitely do not want that. Also, there's fight around minimum wage, and it's mainly about money where and finances, where the Greens and the SPDs are more on the left of the centre, so to say, and the Liberals are very conservative and they want fiscal discipline.
Stephanie, we will talk about this again very soon, I'm sure. Thank you very much indeed. That's Stephanie Bolton, London correspondent for Die Welt. Now, Pope Francis has expressed shame over a report detailing decades of abuse in the French Catholic Church. The landmark report found that in France, an estimated 216,000 children were sexually abused by members of the Catholic clergy in the last 70 years. Think about that number, 216,000. The Pope called on leaders of the Church to make sure similar tragedies never happen again. Well, Christopher Lamb is Rome correspondent for the weekly Catholic newspaper The Tablet and author of The Outsider, Pope Francis and his battle to reform the Church, and he joins us now. Christopher, good evening. It beggars belief that so many children could have been sexually abused, and that's just in one country. I suppose the suspicion is that if it happened in France, it will have happened elsewhere.
Yes, that's right. The figures are really horrific, and sadly and tragically, it's of course not just France. We've had similar reports that have detailed abuse in the United States, in Germany, in Australia. We've had obviously the inquiry in the UK, the public inquiry into abuse that's focused on the church. So this is really terrible. These are terrible statistics, and I think the only thing that we can say that in terms of the church trying to get a grip on this issue is the fact that this report was commissioned and funded by the bishops, the church itself. It wasn't an outside agency or the state saying, you've got to clean this up, you've got to sort this out. It was the church itself saying, we have to face the terrible truth of abuse ourselves, and to have this report and this inquiry to uncover the numbers, what happened, and to try and find ways to reform and to change to make sure that this never happens again.
How did they come to this number, 216,000? Because presumably not every single one of the 216,000 came forward.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing is, there are some questions over the statistics, because if you look at the numbers of priests accused, it's about roughly 3%, 2.9%. Now, that is lower than other numbers, other reports that we've seen that are similar. Now, of course, this is going back over many decades to 1950. But when you have a lower number of priests accused, you would not expect the number of instances of abuse to be so high. But that seems to be the case here. I mean, look, one case is too many. And so, I think these numbers are just horrific. There may be some questions about exactly how they have arrived at this slight discrepancy between numbers of a priest accused and huge numbers of allegations, and huge numbers of instances of abuse, I should say. But I think that really for the church, it's less about quibbling over the numbers. It's more about focusing on how to reform.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's Christopher Lamb, Rome correspondent for The Tablet. Coming up in 10 minutes' time, we'll be starting our Wednesday edition of Cross Question with Andrew Pearce, Miata Fambulo, Councillor David Rodwell and Olivia Utley. Lines are open 0345 6060 973.
Ian Dale, text 84850. This is LBC.
It's 10 to 8. The government has insisted it's the right time to cut the £20 uplift in universal credit. Charities are warning removing the increase will push families into poverty, but the Deputy Prime Minister has insisted it won't force them to choose between heating and eating. Well, earlier I spoke to Helen Barnard, Deputy Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So today the universal credit cut of £20 a week from what it was comes into effect. What effect do you think this is going to have, Helen?
Well, we know it's going to affect around 5.5 million families, and they're going to lose about £1,000 out of their annual income, so £20 a week. That will pull probably 500,000 people into poverty, but of course it will make a lot of people already there a lot worse off. And I mean, we've been hearing from people all day talking about how it's going to affect their daily lives. And people are really, really scared. So a lot of people are saying they're not going to be able to put food on the table, keep the heating on, pay the bills. And we know it's going to have consequences for people's health, mental health and physical health. And it's going to really grind people down.
Now, the government would say, well, it was always meant to be a temporary increase to help people through COVID. Now, OK, we're not quite through COVID yet. That is very true. But do you think that at some point it was inevitable that it would end, even if it didn't end now, even if it was in 3 months or 6 months' time?
I mean, I think one thing that's been interesting is there is a different conversation around this as compared to something like furlough, which was very definitely something that was only for the pandemic. So when they raised universal credit, what they actually said was, essentially, we've realised that the safety net has become too low. And over the last few months, when I've been listening to what particularly Conservative MPs, former Secretaries of State have said, what they said is that all of the cuts and freezes that have happened have taken that safety net down to a level that it just doesn't do its job anymore. So this was restoring not all of what was taken at all, but some of it, to get it just to a point where people can live on it. And I think the idea that it's the right thing to kind of yank that away and leave people unable to cover the essentials, I think is, I mean, morally, I don't think it's right, but also economically, it's sucking money out of economies that need to recover. And this is not going to help that happen.
Now, I think you're also concerned about a number of people who are renting who are going to be in danger of eviction.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things that pushes people to need food banks, for instance, is because they're stuck in expensive homes with high rents. They're trying to keep up with the rent, but that leaves them without money for anything else. One of the things this is going to do is to pull away more of their ability to do that. And of course, although the government raised the housing benefit you get during the pandemic, they've then frozen it again in cash terms. So rents have already gone up and that money has already fallen further behind.
Now, wages are going up by more than they were before, certainly if you're in the private sector, not necessarily if you're in the public sector. Boris Johnson, in his speech today, was extolling the virtues of higher wages. Now, obviously, for 40% of people on universal credit are in work, so if there are high wages, that's going to help them. But of course, we've got this taper system, haven't we, where I think it's 63p in the pound you keep if you're working extra hours. Now, you'd presumably like to see that, so the taxable part of that was 90p in the pound. It's come down to 63. Presumably, you'd like to see that figure fall.
Yes, I mean, under the old system, there were all sorts of different taper rates depending on exactly which combination of benefits you were on. So one of the good things about universal credit is it combines it, so it's a lot simpler. So yes, taking that down a bit would help, but actually for people on low incomes, you would get a lot more benefit from keeping some money in the what's called the standard allowance, the basic amount you get, and also introducing a higher amount you can earn before it starts getting tapered away. In this kind of economy, that would do more good at the moment. But also, of course, as you know, universal credit is for people in work, but there's about 1.7 million people who can't work because they are disabled or sick or caring. And of course, wages going up doesn't help them at all, but they're still facing higher energy bills and higher inflation with a lot less money to go cover their costs.
This all sounds as if the whole benefit system is very ungenerous, but you compare it to quite a lot of other countries, not every country, but we do have a much more generous benefit system than most, don't we? I mean, we can all argue that the universal credit cut shouldn't be taking place at the moment, but generally we ought to be proud of the way that we support people in need, didn't we?
I think we should definitely be proud of the fact that we have a social security system. It's not that generous when you compare it to most other European countries. So now that this cut has come into force, we've got one of the lowest unemployment benefit rates of comparable countries, and it's actually now the lowest it's ever been compared to earnings. It's gone right down to where it was back in 1990. So this cut has really pushed back the level of support you can get back to a point where it really it's one of the things. It has a direct impact of not being able to put food on the table, but it also increases the insecurity people face and the instability. And that has knock-on effects, because one of the things the Prime Minister wants is for people to move to better paid jobs, which lots of people wish there were more better paid jobs. But actually, if you want people to move around in work, they need to have some sense of security that if it doesn't work out, they will be able to rely on something until they get back on their feet. And the more you cut away at social security, the more anxious people are, the more their mental health suffers, and the higher the risk is of trying anything new, because the consequences of it not working out are so devastating.
I suppose we should also point out we do have one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe. I mean, certainly France is way, way above us. Germany, not so much. I think Germany is slightly less, but most European countries have far more unemployed people than we do. Helen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Helen Barnard there, Deputy Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Now, the world's first malaria vaccine has been approved by the World Health Organization. The new jab prevents 30% of severe cases of malaria. To give you an idea of just how good news this could be, nearly 290 million people are infected with malaria every year, and more than 400,000 people die of the disease. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Oksana Pizik, global health expert and infectious diseases lecturer at University College London.
Well, malaria has been with us for millennia, and this vaccine is not just a first for malaria, it is the first developed for any parasitic disease. And parasites are much more complex than viruses or bacteria. So the quest for this vaccine for malaria has been underway for 100 years. This is the making of public health history.
And how many people die each year through malaria? And with this vaccine, I don't know whether any vaccine can ever be 100% effective, but what percentage effectiveness do you think we're going to have here?
Almost 500,000 deaths per year, nearly all of them in sub-Saharan Africa, are because of malaria. And among that, 260,000 typically occur in children under the age of 5. So children and pregnant women are most at risk of contracting malaria. Putting it in another way, every 2 minutes, a child dies of malaria. So a huge amount of progress has been made over the years, but we're seeing that this particular vaccine, in combination with other tools, including anti-malarials, can improve a reduction in hospitalization by 70%. Alone, without those added tools, it's lower. We see about prevention at about 39% of malaria cases and 29% in severe cases. But the key here is that altogether we have a much more robust protection plan. And a modeling study conducted last year estimated that it could prevent 5.4 million cases and 23,000 deaths in children younger than the age of 5 each year. So that's a huge victory.
And is this vaccine specifically for children or for everybody?
So it works by essentially limiting the ability of the parasites to mature in the liver and cause clinical disease. So while children are at the highest risk, it can be used in diverse population sets.
So it sounds as if it's a bit of a game changer.
Certainly, again, when used with other tools, so we're talking about mosquito nets as well as these anti-malarial drugs, this can, again, be a huge lifesaver for children that are at most risk. So 90% of those deaths are happening in sub-Saharan Africa. And anti-malarials alone typically tend to be targets for counterfeit drugs, because this is the highest target of falsified drugs, because there is so much prevalence in these regions in the world. So this will also help reduce the rate of substandard and falsified anti-malarials, because we have a new toolkit. GSK, again, a British pharmaceutical company, making it affordable by promising that they're only going to have the cost at 5% above what it costs to make. So again, it's going to be effective in that region of the world.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And that was cheers. Bye. And that was Oksana Pizik, Global Health Expert and Lecturer at University College London. Well, coming up in a moment, it is Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. We are delighted to be joined on the panel by Andrew Pearce. He's woken up. He's joined us for Cross Question. Miata Fambula is here from the New Economics Foundation. Councillor Darren Rodwell, leader of Barking and Dagenham Borough Council. And Olivia Utley is Assistant Comment Editor at The Telegraph. We've got lots of calls already coming in, but if you'd like to add to them, the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, on the LBC YouTube and Facebook channels too.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC. This is LBC. From Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question. With Ian Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:04. Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. I'm Ian Dale. Let me introduce you to my panel. Joining us via Zoom is Andrew Pearce, Assistant Comment Editor at Assistant Editor. I just demoted him at the Daily Mail, and of course my colleague on LBC. Councillor Darren Rodwell is leader of the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham Council. Olivia Utley is Assistant Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph, and no doubt soon to be Assistant Editor, Olivia. Phew. Miata Fambula is Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. Now, they are here to take your calls. We'll take any subject you like. Obviously, I'm sure several of you have got opinions and questions on what Boris Johnson said in his conference speech today, but lots of other subjects around too as well. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player, the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, our YouTube and Facebook channels too.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Ian Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's get on with our first question. It's from David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, panel. In the spirit of the day, my question is, how can this present Tory government call itself conservative? And I say that for three reasons briefly. According to the Office of National Statistics, the real wages adjusted for inflation have just recovered to the levels last seen in 2007, pre the financial crash. So we've had 14 years of average weekly wage stagnation in real terms, no improvement in living standards. Secondly, despite a decade of austerity, the national debt increased from 1 trillion in 2010 to 1.8 trillion in 2019. We've now added another 400 billion due to COVID. So it now stands at 2.2 trillion, which is the highest level since World War II. And it's cost us 600 billion in interest in the last 10 years, which is 4 times the national health annual budget.
Okay, let's go on with the third one.
This has happened when the UK tax burden at 35% of GDP is at its highest level since 1948. We're working for the government now till the 1st of June. Stagnant living standards, record national debt, highest tax burden since 1948. How's that conservatism?
Longest question in the history of cross question there. Andrew Pearce, let's start with you. But before we go to that, what happened to you this morning? You were empty-chaired on Good Morning Britain. Did you oversleep, Andrew? Hard night, was it?
No, it wasn't so much that. It was my hotel just didn't... I arranged an alarm call with them and they didn't ring. And I set a call on my mobile as well, and that didn't work. So I woke up at 7 o'clock when I should have been for just finishing my routine on Good Morning Britain. Did they send for you instead, Ian?
No, thank goodness they didn't. No, if you... And did you appear with Nick Ferrari? I think you were due on with him as well.
No, I missed him as well. Yeah, so that's why I'm making it up to the LBC family with you, Ian.
Well, we're delighted that you've made it with us. Right, answer the question from David in Enfield, Andrew.
Look, I have a lot of sympathy with what David says. At that Tory conference, Ian, it was very difficult to find anybody who supported the rise in national insurance next year. That's the tax rise, of course. There's going to be an increase in corporation tax too. And so it often doesn't feel like a very conservative government. And the speech today was magnificent speech by Boris. It was a barnstorming bravura performance, but very light on policy and very light on how he's going to deliver this transformed new economy with high wages and high skills. So it re-established Boris Johnson's reputation as the foremost performer in the political establishment, but it did leave a lot of questions unanswered. And also, he did say in the speech, didn't he, a low tax economy. Well, when's he going to start cutting taxes?
Couldn't you have asked the same to Margaret Thatcher in 1981 when she put up taxes?
You could, but it was a different side. It was different. It was. We'd just been through the winter of discontent. The economy was in a very bad place, and she got a lot of criticism, of course, for putting up taxes in '81. Remember that letter from all those economists in the Times? She was proved right. She got it. She got most things right, in my view, Ian. But I'm not sure that putting national insurance up next year, when we've got soaring fuel costs and a real cost of living crisis, I don't think that's the right time to be putting up taxes. And national insurance, of course, hits people the lowest paid hardest.
Okay, Miata, you're the professional economist on the panel. What did you make of, well, first of all, in terms of David's question, can the Tory party still call them Conservatives when effectively they're adopting uber Keynesian policies?
They are. And I mean, I think it's a strange government because I don't really know where they sit on ideology. You know, they're sort of pragmatic, which I think is actually a good thing in politics. I think the difficulty and the point that was made in the question is that actually we've had a decade of, in many respects, economic failure. You know, you can't have had 10 years in which living standards have budged, and that's a success story. It's not. There's obviously the question of the debts, and then there's a question of tax rises. So I think there's a backdrop of failure. I think you've got a Prime Minister who, it's not clear what his project is. You know, lots of chat about levelling up, Build Back Better, great. What does it all mean? And what's your compass? What are you trying to drive? It's still completely unclear. I think what is, for me, a bit of hope is, you know, I don't think we should be ideological about things. I think when there are big problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's living standards not budging, I want governments that try to fix those problems. And if that means that you lean to, you know, the traditional left, then so be it. If that means you say you invest, so be it. And I think that is the right mode, given the scale of the challenges that we face. I just wish that there was a bit more clarity about what on earth he's about and what he's trying to do for the country beyond the bluster.
I mean, going back in time a bit here, but how surprised were you when Rishi Sunak announced the furlough programme, for example, back in March last year?
Huge. I mean, I was cheering a Tory Chancellor because it was the right, because it was the right. I think it was the right intervention. You know, he looked at the scale of the problem. He looked across the continent. Germany, essentially in the last financial crisis, put in place a version of furlough. And they've been able to scale it up and scale it down. And in many respects, one of the reasons why they were able to respond so well and bounce back from the financial crisis is because they had it. And I think it was the right thing that the Chancellor wasn't ideological and actually did the right thing. And we are so much better and so much stronger for it. What worries me is that it feels like ideology is starting to kick in now. Because I think a lot of the decisions that we made, including the cut to UC, are born and driven by ideology rather than what makes economic sense and what's the right thing to do. And for me, that is a step backwards because I think he got it right a lot of the times in the pandemic. Not always, didn't go as far as I wanted, but he got some of the core interventions right.
Now, Olivia, I'm going to take a risk here because I think that your grandfather was T.E. Utley, am I right?
Yeah.
Thank goodness for that. I mean, he was a great conservative philosopher. Now, I don't know if you've inherited his philosophy expertise, but when you look at the current Conservative Party, what do you think he would have made of the current Conservative position?
Oh, goodness. I've never met him.
I did.
Oh, good. Everyone else seems to have done. I think that, it would worry most Thatcherites. It's true that Margaret Thatcher pushed up taxes in 1981, but as Andrew says, the situation was very different. And what Thatcher did do was really support business, let business get on with what business is supposed to do. She talked a lot about the make the cake bigger and don't worry too much about how you're sharing it out. If there's a cake bigger, if there's a big cake, there'll be lots to go round. And I think Boris is sort of trying to invoke that spirit of Thatcher. He talked about her today, and he talked about capitalism unashamedly, which was quite nice to hear a Conservative Prime Minister do, because we haven't seen that for quite a long time. And of course, last year he talked about greed as a good thing because it's driving. So all of this sort of rhetoric is quite good and quite positive. And I think a sort of classic Conservative ideology, which Thatcherites would sort of admire. But then when it comes to the practicalities, he's just put up taxes the most since any Prime Minister since the war. And that is just so unconservative that sort of any amount of bluster and talking, and I agree that it was a fantastic barnstorming speech, and I was getting furious with Boris Johnson, but I couldn't help laughing, and I kind of just liked him watching that speech. But I just think if you're going to do a tax rise like that, it sort of cancels out everything else. So I think most sort of classic Thatcherites would be pretty fed up with him, really.
Darren Rodwell, you are not a classic Thatcherite, but you were. We met at the Conservative Party conference this week. What on earth was a leader of a Labour council, as Neil Kinnock might have said, doing at the Conservative Party conference?
Because a Labour leader goes where his people need him to go. And
follow the money.
I've got to go where the business is. And I managed to see 4 ministers in 36 hours. So hopefully that's good business, because actually we have a lot of opportunity. Now, what's really interesting, you talk about conservatism, I think what you've got is Borisism, because Boris is a bigger brand than what you're seeing within the Conservative Party. So he can get away with doing different things that are unconventional because his brand is so strong. And I think that's what's caused Labour a problem over many years. Now, my problem is, and we hear all the different bits, but if I take my borough, Last April, I had 14,000 families on UC. This April just gone, I had 35,000 families. After last week, we are predicting over 50,000 families. So that's 1 in 3 families that will be unemployed in my borough who have just lost £1,000 annually. That is massive.
And it doesn't just affect them, does
no,
it? Because if they haven't got the money, they can't spend it in local shops.
They can't pay their rent. Remember, in London, our rents are astronomical for poor families. So the fact that we are the poorest borough in London, 50% of my children live in, poverty. Absolutely.
When you say your children?
Well, in
your borough.
All the children in my borough are my children. I can go to jail for them, so they're my children. So I look after them, or try to. So that's why I was there, and I want to try and be as productive as we can. And I do agree. Some of the things we had to do. Furlough was the right thing. How it stopped, I don't think is been the way it should have happened, because it's just caused me at a local level a massive issue, and it's caused actually the country a massive issue, because what we're actually seeing now is it doesn't matter where you are in the country, poverty is really rearing its head in a way that we haven't seen since the 70s, since those dark days of fuel crisis and 4-day weeks, and I remember that
3-day weeks.
Or 3-day weeks. It was terrible.
That's what radicalised me into politics.
Well, mine was beating the BNP, but we all come in it for different reasons.
I remember interviewing Nick Griffin in a council house in Barking in about 2009 when they were I think that it was the time of the by-election. I think so. And when you meet a Tory minister, I mean, what's your approach? How do you're basically holding out your begging bowl, aren't you? How do you persuade them to?
No.
Aren't you not?
No. So let me put it this way to you. No one's got more opportunity than we have as a single borough. So I'm going to build 50,000 homes over the 20 years. That's needed. London needs it, Barking and Dagenham needs it. 85% of the houses I'm building are going to local people, which is really important because 1 in 3 are paying market rents, and we build all under that. So there's an opportunity. We can help rebuild the economy. At the same time, we've got the only international freight terminus in London. That means it can go to the whole of Europe, the whole of Asia and Africa. Well, that's massive for the UK economy. So I need the Conservative government to invest into that. We've just done the Freeport announcement with the Thames Freeport. Well, that's massive for the whole region. So I'm not going there with a begging bowl. What I'm going there with is the opportunity to do business, but do business for my community that works for my community with my values, because they are different to other people's values. But if we can find a middle ground, again, this is not, we shouldn't have student politics when we're talking about people's lives. We're in the same place we were after the war. After the war, we had the biggest house building programme. We managed to bring in a new state support system financially. We also brought in the National Health Service, and with that, it was great for generations after. Well, I think we're in that space again. So how do we do cross-party working like we do in London? So I'm also Deputy Chair of London Councils, and it's a cross-party organisation, and we work together to better London's opportunities.
Andrew Pearce, you listened to Darren there. Do you think that message will be heard by Tory ministers?
Yeah, I think so, because look, levelling up isn't just about the north, is it? It's got to main places like Barking and Dagenham, which have traditionally, I mean, my mum's from Dagenham. She's not with us now, but she was brought up in Dagenham. I know the area well. It's been traditionally a poorer part of the southeast, and so housing is a key part of levelling up. And so I hope ministers do listen to him. He was very persuasive just now, Ian. So I'm quite sure he was persuasive when he talked to the ministers.
Well, I'll tell you what, if he's persuaded you, he's done a great job. Right. Thank you very much to David in Enfield. I think we got your opinions from your question, David, so I'm not going to come back to you if you'll forgive me. We'll move on in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 18 minutes past 8. 21 minutes past 8, our panel tonight, Andrew Pearce, Miata Fanbulle from the New Economics Foundation, Councillor Darren Rodwell from the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, he's the leader of the council there, Olivia Utley is Assistant Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. Now, if you've been listening to our conversation during the break, I think I'm going to try and reprise it now, because it's really interesting, because Miata, tell us what you thought of Boris's speech. Sorry, I should say Boris Johnson's speech rather than Boris's speech generally.
I thought it was completely incoherent. I thought it was complete waffle. Couldn't follow it.
just thought it was awful.
Olivia Rutley.
I really enjoyed it, and I mean, I can see, like, if you're a professional economist and you're listening to sort of go through and watch out for the policies coming up, it was not like that at all. But from an enjoyment factor, it was great. And you did get the gist of what he was sort of going for. And I think that's what most people are kind of watching it for. You got the person he was trying to be, you got the message he was getting across. There was some sort of substance there, but it was very light on the detail. And I think I see what you mean by all over the place.
And Andrew, you called it barnstorming earlier. Can you see why, say, people in professional politics or professional commentary might have seen it through a very different lens?
Oh, completely. It was completely about Boris. The whole conference, actually, Ian, was about Boris Johnson. Every other minister was restricted to 7 minutes. They had to speak in a smaller hall on a smaller stage. So it was all about the big main event, which was the speech today. 45 minutes, much better length than that dreary dirge we had to put up with Keir Starmer last week. But it was just theatrical. There was very little detail in there at all, which is why I should think economists are in despair. And a lot of Tory MPs will be a bit in despair. But I think also, Ian, they'll think it was a great performance, full of boosterism, full of optimism, which is what Keir Starmer absolutely manifestly lacks. And that plays well with the public, with the voters. I think they still think he's box office with the voters.
And Darren Rodwell, in Barking and Dagenham, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's classified as the Red Wall or not, because it's still very safe Labour seats there, or at least certainly in the Barking bit. What do you think that your voters there made of it? Because the Conservatives in the last election got 47% of the working class vote, 32% went Labour. There will be people in your area who quite liked it, probably.
They would have liked it because he's a great showman, and there's nothing wrong with that. He was a great showman when he was.
I feel a song coming up.
No, but look, you've got to take your hat off to the Prime Minister. He knows what his audience is, and he knows how to rile the audience. And I won't disagree with that, because actually we're all actors in our own way. You know, when I was fighting the BNP, you know, and taking the abuse, the death threats and everything else, I was still standing there saying, come on then, if you want to carry on, let's carry on. But I'm gonna give you my version of the events. If you look at the substance, and I can understand why some people are going, wow, what was all this about? Actually, you know, from what I've read, coming here this evening, there was 8 things he said that were not true. Now, that can be for debate and conversation. I've not seen it all, but what I saw of it, it was entertaining. And people at this moment in time, remember, we've just gone through a world pandemic. They want hope. They want inspiration.
Did you get that from Keir Starmer last week?
Personally, of course I did, because I was there. I was in the hall. It was a much better. It was so well received in the way that actually it was the first time you actually heard his story in a way that actually could connect with people. So yes, he's not going to be Boris Johnson because he's a different character. But actually, when you actually looked at what he was saying, there was a lot more substance to it about his world.
Let's
that's very important.
Go to another question. It's from Anthony in Blackpool. Hi, Anthony.
Hello, Ian. I'm phoning from Blackpool South, one of the UK's most deprived constituencies. It's been subjected to severe austerity cuts. Currently, the mortality rates are 20 years below the national average. My question is, how can Johnson blithely talk about levelling up when the government's taking £83 a month off the most disadvantaged people in the country who aren't having the time of their life?
Did you not hear the section where he talked about Blackpool and he said, look, in Ribble Valley, 30 miles down the road, the life expectancy is so much higher than it is in Blackpool. And he said he wanted to do something about that.
But the austerity cuts over the last 10 years, it seems essentially it's all talk and no action. People here are dying 20 years before everybody else. It's all intention, but there's no action.
Okay, well, Miata, this is I mean, life expectancy in different parts of the country, if you look at Glasgow, for example, I think the male life expectancy there is something like 58 to 60 years, which I mean is appalling. Now, this is a long-term thing. It's not something that's been done in the last 10 years. This has been happening for decades. Do you think the levelling up agenda, however you define it, can do something about this sort of thing?
So, there's a lot of work that looks at the sort of determinants of health, and poverty and living standards is a big part of that. And what we've seen is, yes, a lot of this has been decades in the making, but the last 10 years, in some places, life expectancy is going back. Which is different, which is a turning point. So something has happened, and I think it's the combination.
Can we just quantify that? Because I think I'm right in saying that it's not going back. The rise in life expectancy has been stopped, so it's not actually dropping.
Yet.
Am I right on
yes,
that?
That's right. That's right. But having made progress year on year, we're now stalling.
Yeah.
And I think it's being driven by two things. One is the fact that we have seen living standards basically stagnate for a decade, which is, it's historic. It's never happened before. And then I think the second thing is you combine that with the fact that, the social protection. So people talk about public sector investment, but it's all there to provide social protections for people, whether that's investment in health, social care, whether that's, your social security system. And we had 10 years where that was chipped away. So it was a combination of those two things. At the very time that people were being squeezed was not the time to pull the rug from underneath them. And the combined effect of that, poorer people struggling, is the thing that's feeding through the numbers. So yes, long in the making, but we certainly haven't helped over the last decade.
Olivia.
I think that this is going to be a big problem for Boris, because we are actually now 2 years into his 80-seat majority, and he talked about levelling up on that steps of Downing Street speech, and he had this big vision, but we're getting sort of halfway into the parliamentary term and he hasn't done very much yet. To give him his due, he has had a pandemic to deal with, but when you've got COVID hitting areas like Blackpool much harder than other places, then he's sort of got to do something soon. And I think the problem still is that there are still not really meat on the bones of the levelling up agenda. And you've got I heard Michael Gove do a very eloquent description of sort of what levelling up is in theory, but we should have reached that point a couple of months after the election, and we should now be having sort of policies in place which are doing something which will change the mortality rate in Blackpool, for example, sort of 15 years down the line. And I think the other problem for Boris is that because he loves being popular, he loves being loved, and policies which don't give that sort of immediate gratification don't appeal to him that much. So, I mean, for example, planning reform, if we tore up our extremely complicated planning system and sort of started again, it would have dividends far down the line, but it wouldn't have dividends immediately. And so Boris looks like he's probably going to shelve it. Similarly, with sort of thinking seriously about how to improve life expectancy in some of the poorest places in the UK, it'll take a while for those changes to sort of be seen and come through, and for people to like Boris for it. It isn't a quick win. It's not low-hanging fruit. So I worry he might neglect it for a bit longer.
We'll hear from Darren and Andrew in just a minute, so I can go to the news on time for once. It's 8:30. Let's get the news headlines from Lucinda Horsley. 8:34 on LBC. Let me reintroduce you to my panel. My LBC colleague, Andrew Pearce, is with us, Miata Fambolo from the New Economics Foundation, Councillor Darren Rodwell, leader of the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham Council, and Olivia Utley, assistant comment editor at The Telegraph. We're in the middle of answering a question which has now gone off my screen. I'm trying to remember what it was. Can you remember what it was, Darren?
It was about life expectancy.
That's the one, in Blackpool. So the question from Anthony in Blackpool was, why is Blackpool's mortality rate the highest? Has this got anything to do with Tory cuts and the continuation of these cuts?
I think it's austerity has gone too far, and I don't think it's only happening in Blackpool. Again, in London, I can say in Barking and Dagenham. I think it's every tube stop from the city east, you lose a year in life expectancy.
Really?
And that's quite a stark thing to be able to.
So you want to stop in Aldgate, really, don't you?
You do, really, if you can help it. Where my in-laws live, that'd be great. But I don't want to live with the in-laws. I'm quite happy where I am, thanks.
They're probably listening.
They probably aren't. So I'm safe to say that. But no, like in truth, I think this is the biggest problem the Prime Minister's going to have, because there is a lot of showmanship. But levelling up isn't about showmanship. It's about hard work, rolling your sleeves up and making change happen. So, again, I'll go back to London because that's the place I know. As a London councils, we're a cross-party organisation and we understand these issues. It doesn't matter what flag you fly under because actually we're all challenged with the same particular issues.
I mean, what you're effectively saying is it's a bit like Churchill in the war saying to the Americans, give us the tools and we'll finish the job. And local councillors are going to be absolutely crucial in the levelling up agenda, aren't they?
They are. So, look, people got to understand what councils are. We are the fourth emergency service, but we're not there with the blue light. We're there every day, 365 days a year, 24/7. We're the people that kept this country together through COVID. And people go, no, you didn't, the NHS. No, hold on. If it wasn't what the local government did to keep people in their homes, to make sure all that support was at their front door, the NHS wouldn't have coped. Government wouldn't have been able to do the vaccine rollout without local government support. So we are there as that glue that keeps society together. And as I say, it doesn't matter what flag you fly under because you have to do it collectively.
Well, when we met in Blackpool, I said to you I wanted to get more council leaders on this programme, and you are justifying my faith in that and we will continue to do so. Andrew Pearce, very briefly from you if we can, why do you think Blackpool's mortality rate is higher than other areas?
Well, I think it's historic. It's been like it probably for many, many years. But I think it was really encouraging to hear a Tory Prime Minister talking about mortality rates in different parts of the country and saying that he wants to try and do something about it. And talking of councillors, we know that Michael Gove, who's in charge of the levelling up agenda, I think he's one of the most effective cabinet ministers Boris has got, has struck up a great relationship with Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester. Burnham was praising Gove this week. So he thinks he's got something important to say and do about levelling up. And let's hope he's right, because they've got to get on with it.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for your question. Let's move on to Terry in Camborne in Cornwall. Hello, Terry.
Hello there, panel and Ian. Everybody okay?
Hi. We're all absolutely thriving.
I would just like to ask the panel, do they think that Macron, after the last couple of weeks, President Macron, after the last few weeks, do you still see Macron and France as an ally to Great Britain?
Well, this is on the back of the French government threatening to cut Britain's energy supplies, blockade the Channel Tunnel so we can't get goods for Christmas. This is all to do with the fishing dispute with Jersey more than anything, it seems. Olivia, it probably plays well to a domestic audience for Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm sure, well, I think it does play well to a domestic audience, especially the AUKUS thing. I think that really infuriated the French, that Britain and America and Australia had clubbed together without France. France has sort of great submariners. They're proud of their maritime abilities and they didn't see why they were left out of that. So I think that does play well. But I think that France is still an ally. It's clear that France is still an ally. But Macron is just sort of behaves a bit like a petulant child, and it does make it seem a little bit as though he doesn't want to be friends with Britain. I actually think the way Boris Johnson deals with him is fantastic. Like, I loved the Fronglow stuff. I know who's sort of some pompous people said, oh, it's very childish the way he does this, and he's not a serious leader and he won't be taken seriously on the global stage, etc., etc. But actually that's exactly what Emmanuel Macron deserves, a bit of sort of ribbing, and it made him look a bit silly, actually. Donnez-moi and break him. Come on, Macron, grow up, sort of thing. So I think that on a fundamental level, yes, the French are clearly still allies, and I think on the big things, Macron sort of will be there with the UK. But at the moment, it does sort of seem like he's throwing his toys out the pram at every possible opportunity. And I think patience is wearing thin, definitely in Britain. But I also think he's pushing it with NATO as well at the moment, Macron. And I think patience is wearing thin sort of globally. So I think some people might be quite glad to be rid of him, although the alternatives...
Well,
exactly.
The alternative could be my new friend Michel Barnier after my interview with him last week. Darren, what do you think about Monsieur Macron?
If I'm being honest, I don't know enough. I've got enough going on trying to run a borough. Look, at a national level, I think, as I said before, I think Boris Johnson is a good showman. I think Macron's doing the same. I agree. I think it's what he's doing. He's playing to his own audience. Whoever think elections come around and, what you've got to do and how you do it. I mean, we've seen that in many different countries. So I don't think for one moment they're not our friends. I mean, there's a lot of history. The last 100 years has shown that we've had to be close on lots of different subjects, and I had to think, well, hold on, why are we doing it with Australia and America but not with NATO? Because NATO has been that peacekeeping force all my lifetime and beyond. So I without knowing the full detail, it's really, really difficult. But friendship shouldn't be broken over silly little posturing. If that was the case, none of us have had any friends.
Andrew Pierce, you're never guilty of posturing, are you? What's your view of Monsieur Macron?
He's been a huge sulky ever since Brexit. That's what this is all about. He's absolutely enraged by it. He couldn't believe that Britain voted to leave the European Union. And this silly dispute about, 30 trawlers have been denied access to fishing waters. It's ridiculous. And he's got an election to fight next year. The polls aren't looking very good for him. So Britain is a very good... he's beaten up Britain at every opportunity to play to his domestic audience. That's what it's all about. And I imagine, sadly, he'll probably win next year because I think he's completely ghastly.
And it's not like we haven't done it, is it, Andrew? I mean, I do believe some other people have done it in the elections. I don't know. I mean, looking at the national press and everything about what's happened with Europe, we're doing the same.
As the front of the Sun said this morning, he's taking the we. But I mean, it's quite interesting. Yesterday, was it yesterday or the day before? I interviewed a French MP about the Jersey fishing dispute, because that's what I think this is mainly all about. And I said, look. The Jersey government has granted 75 fishing licences because all of those boats had come up with the requisite paperwork. They proved that they were fishing in these waters before Brexit, but 47 haven't done that, despite the deadlines being extended. And I said to him, how many licences have the French authorities granted to the Jersey fishermen? He said, I do not know. I said, 2. I did not know that. And this is exactly what Darren said. It's posturing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, look, it's posturing, but it's posturing on all sides. I think we're all behaving quite badly, to be honest. And I take
Stand up for Britain, Miata.
I take a simple view, which is that we've generally got some enemies out there, and France isn't one of them. And we need our friends to be really close in a world where actually it's globally there are lots of threats. We are in a new age, cybersecurity. There are things that we should generally be fighting and worrying about. Our friendship with Europe, our friendship with, countries that have always stood shoulder to shoulder shouldn't be one of it. So why are you picking fights with your buddies when, my God, you need them by your side at the moment?
We're not picking the fight, are we?
It goes both ways. We have behaved as badly as they're behaving. All sides need to grow up.
How have we behaved badly?
I think a lot of the rhetoric around Brexit, getting out of Brexit, the threat that we're going to, throw up the Northern Ireland Protocol rather than negotiate a settlement, it's all nonsense. It's all bluster. And we are blustering with our friends when we should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them because there are other threats in the world.
I cannot believe you've accused Boris Johnson of bluster. I just can't understand that. Very bizarre. I think it's time to go to a break. It's coming up to 8:45. 8:48. Let's go to Sarah in Hemel Hempstead. Hi, Sarah.
Excuse me. Good evening, Ian. Good evening to you.
Hello. Hi.
I'd like to talk about housing, actually. I think Boris Johnson going on about increasing wages and so on, unless you do something about the cost of living, is a waste of time, really, because you can have all the increases in wages you like, but if you can't control the cost of the most basic things like housing, you could earn 100 grand a year as a teacher, but if you don't do anything about the housing, because 3 times your salary is the normal mortgage arrangement, so 300 grand, which would be the mortgage you could afford, would buy you a 2-bedroom flat in Watford. So, I mean, unless you do something about the housing and young people can't get on the housing ladder and so on, and it causes, interest rates will go up.
Okay, so Sarah, we need to get to your question because we're nearing the end of the programme.
So, I'm sorry. Do you think housing mortgages should be purely buy to live in, not buy to let mortgages? Because the long-term effects of this will be catastrophic.
That's an interesting one, because buy-to-let mortgages have sort of mushroomed over the last 10 or 15 years, I think. And the government has put extra stamp duty tax on buy-to-let mortgages. But what's it like in your area, Darren, in Barking and Dagenham?
I knew you was going to ask that. So in my area, it's actually massively changed the area. So the ward I represent is 72% buy-to-let HMO properties, which means 91% of the people that were there 10 years ago aren't there today. And across the whole borough, about 1 in 3 properties are buy-to-let or HMO.
Is that typical, or are you an untypical example?
Well, we've been an area where people wanted to invest because the properties were the cheapest in London, and you could get their highest yield. So for a normal, what would be a Becontree estate house, the one I live in and one others would have come from originally, council rent is about £500, give or take, and private rent now is about £2,000. So people, this is not a third of their income. So we need to change the whole way we do rental, and we do actually trying to buy asset. So I've always believed that you should be able to give people the right to rent, the right to invest, and the right to move, so we can take the stigma away. So I've always been, and this is where you won't like me here, but I hate the term social housing, because it is a derogatory term to say you're on the social, you can't afford to buy the house. And I think we're suffering for that 40 years on, because I think the market has been broken, and it does need a new way of government working together, national and local, to start building the next generation of what would be council housing that could help the whole of society without the stigma.
Andrew Pearce.
Well, the Chancellor, as part of his COVID package, gave us a stamp duty holiday, which all it did was just it lead to even bigger property price inflation, particularly in London and the South East. It's almost impossible now for young people to get a foot on the property ladder. It's a real problem, because I bought my first property when I was 19, and it was a noble aspiration. It was it was Thatcher's property-owning democracy, and the property cost me £19,000. A terrace house in Worcester, it would probably now cost £350,000. It's a real problem, and part of levelling up, isn't that all going to be to do with housing? I hope it is. We've got to build a lot more houses, but the great reform of planning is dead in the water ever since the Tories lost Chesham and Amersham, the Chesham and Amersham by-election. So I don't quite know where they're going to go forward with that policy.
Miata.
So, look, housing is a massive issue, and I think it's both people being able to afford homes, but also the problem with the rental market. We've got 1 in 5 people renting. That number is just going to keep going up because even if we fix the housing crisis, it's going to take a while to feed through. And I think we actually need quite a radical view on this. I think you don't fix the crisis without building more homes, and we need to have buckets loads of council-led and housing association-led homes that are accessible to a whole load of people who at the moment are locked out of it. I think that has to be part of the solution, but also I think we need to look at the rental market, and we should be in a world where we're talking about long-term tenancies becoming the norm, where we're strengthening the rights of tenants, but we're also looking at, rent controls, dare I say it. But when you say actually in the way that we see in other countries, you index rent rather than extortionate rent rises or random rent rises. So I think you just need greater regulation of that market, because a home is a fundamental, basic thing that everyone needs.
Give me an example of where greater regulation of a market has actually expanded the market.
Gosh, I mean, look, you look across Europe, we have lots of regulated markets. So the water sector is regulated, the energy sector is regulated, even in this country is regulated. The question is, how do you get the balance of regulation right? And at the moment, we have a rental market. It doesn't matter, it's not an essential thing. But when it's something so fundamental and essential as what you live in, you do have to wonder whether it makes sense to just say, off you go. Like, leave it to the market. And actually, we should be providing a basic level of protection. Get it right, get the balance right, and it definitely can be done.
Olivia, are you worried by the expansion of the buy-to-let market? Because it really has mushroomed over the last 10 years, hasn't it?
It has mushroomed, and I think it is a bit of a worry, but I think that sort of tinkering with the buy-to-let market and stopping people who want to buy a house to rent it out, get mortgages, is really just playing with the edges. I think what we really need to do is build many, many more houses. And Robert Jenrick actually had a good plan for this. I think the Prime Minister was on the right track last year when he said sort of think big, think radically, look for huge solutions. But the Tories have got scared because of Chesham and Amersham. They don't like... There are just quite a lot of NIMBYs around who don't like the idea of more houses. And so they're sort of... It's really off-putting if you're just shaking your head like that in the background.
It's just wrong. There's 1.1 million properties that have got planning permission today. Right, in London, there's a quarter of them, or 260,000 that have got planning permission today. The system wasn't broken in planning. In fact, 9 out of 10 planning applications get permission. Right. What we were planning to do, though, and why I would disagree with the white paper, and I'm pleased there's a review of it. I'm not saying it was all wrong. But you've got to give local people the local say about their local area, because that's democracy. By not doing that, you're actually causing a real problem. Where I would say we've got a real problem is at this moment in time, I think we spend something like £23 billion on the housing payments. You know, that is the national cost to us. We're only spending $8 billion on actually building new housing. Now, that can't be good for our society. It's not good for the exchequer, and it's not good for community. So we do need to have a big house building programme. And I say that someone who lives on the Becontree estate, the largest single house building programme. They managed 27,000 homes with all the infrastructure in 12 years, whilst they had horse and cart and steam trains. Now we're just not doing it because there's too much vested interest. It needs to be a national resource, and we need to work together.
I think this is one of those issues that we are really going to concentrate on my programme over the next few months, and hopefully we'll be able to get Michael Gove in to sort of talk for a long time about it, because it is a complicated subject, it's a difficult subject, and you can't do justice to it in a sort of 5-minute section. Sarah, thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to restrict you all to 45 seconds in your answers to the next question, because we're nearly at the end. Mary in Southwark says on a text, Dominic Raab said earlier that misogyny is wrong whether it's a man against a woman or a woman against a man. Does the government just not understand the issue? Olivia.
Yeah, that was an incredibly stupid thing of Dominic Raab to say. I think he's probably right that making misogyny a hate crime, which I think this is what it was about, isn't a particularly good idea. It's one of those sort of virtue signalling policies which sounds nice but doesn't really do anything. And the people we've been talking about, Sarah Everard was murdered. That is already a crime. So I think he sort of had the right idea. But that was an incredibly stupid thing to say, and does sort of give the impression that the government just isn't really listening to women and doesn't quite understand what's going on.
Miata.
I think the quote speaks for itself. I don't think you need to say anything else.
Okay. Well, that gives the two men on the panel a bit more time then. Andrew Pearce.
Well, it was absolutely cringe-making, wasn't it? If he doesn't know what misogyny means, whether it was a misspeak or misquote, but it was shocking, actually. And I'm afraid women they've lost a huge amount of faith in the police and the justice system. And then you get the Prime Minister talking about women in his speech, and then you get the Deputy Prime Minister failing to even understand what misogyny is. It's very, very worrying, and yet another a question mark over why Dominic Raab is still around, frankly.
It was one of the few gaffes at this conference. Normally conferences are full of them, but I can't think of many others this week. Darren?
Well, again, as the borough that gave you equality.
Yes, that's
it's
true.
It's really
isn't it?
important. Yeah,
just explain that.
Well, Mary Wollstonecraft, obviously, she wrote the book about equality between men and women, and most of the republics have her work in there. You got the first women playwrights and Ethelberg, or you got the women of Fords in 68 and 84. So we've got a really proud history in this. I have to say that I'm disappointed someone in such a senior position makes such a silly mistake in a public way, and for once we will agree across the screen that I don't understand how someone can be in that position without knowing the basics about.
You do realise you've done something very bad on this programme over the last hour, Darren, because you've made Barking and Dagenham sound such a fantastic place that everybody is going to want to move there, and the property prices are going to shoot up.
Well, the fact that we've got 2 film studios coming, we're going to be London's Hollywood. The fact that we've got the largest data centre in Europe with digital Dagenham. The fact that we've got Barcelona on Thames down the river. The fact that we've got Mini Manhattan, which will be Barking Town Centre, and you've got the road in Riviera where we're going to have the only women's museum. I think it's a great place to live.
And you got West Ham as well.
Of course, West Ham.
That's Newham, isn't it?
No. Hold on. We won the World Cup for the country. Bobby
did.
Moore and Sir Alf Ramsey came from Barking and Dagenham.
Absolutely right.
So there
you
you go.
are right on
I
that.
know.
Right. Final question from Amanda in Brighton. Therese Coffey, the Work and Pensions Secretary, was videoed last night singing Time of My Life at the Tory conference karaoke evening. What's your karaoke song of choice, and would you like to sing a couple of lines of it? Andrew Pearce.
No, but it would be anything from ABBA, Ian, as you know. So probably it'd probably be Dancing Queen, but I'm not going to sing it. I can't massacre ABBA.
Have you got your tickets yet?
No, but I'm going to get them.
Have you not?
No.
Well, you need to speak to me. Miata.
Gosh, it would be anything Shakira, but I'm completely...
Shakira.
That's it, I'm completely tone deaf. I'm not going to subject anyone to listening to my voice.
Darren?
Oh, mine would be We Are the Champions.
Oh.
And because it means so much to so many people. And it takes me back to Live Aid.
Okay, you're not going to sing it either.
I'm not a chance.
The floor is yours, Olivia.
I was going to go for Dancing Queen as well, but ABBA, I'll go for Waterloo, but I'm not going to sing it.
Ain't nothing but a heartache. And that is the end of the programme. Thank goodness for that. I just sang it for you. Backstreet Boys. I want it that way. And Andrew Pearce, Darren Rodwell, Olivia Utley, Miata Fambola, thank you very much indeed. Very entertaining edition of Cross Question, which will, of course, be back with you next Monday at 8 o'clock on LBC. It's 4 minutes past 9 on LBC. I'm Ian Dale with you until 10. Now, everyone's got an opinion on Boris Johnson. He inspires great devotion from many people in the Conservative Party, but he also... I was going to say inspire, maybe provokes, I think is probably the best word, provokes a lot of hatred as well. Certainly, if you look on social media today, the reaction to his speech has been quite volcanic from his enemies. And I wonder whether that's sometimes because they recognise that a lot of the things he says do appeal to a lot of people who are not traditional Conservative voters. That's how he won such a big majority in the general election, I think. Because a lot of people, both on the left and indeed I think the British media, underestimated the appeal of Boris Johnson to people who are not like him. And it was natural in a way, because you think, well, how can an old Etonian, sort of vaguely intellectual person appeal to a working class person in Hartlepool? Well, I'm not sure I can explain it particularly, but we know that he does. That there were so many people in the general election who came on this programme and said, well, I'm not voting Conservative, I'm voting for Boris. Gillian Keegan, who was the Apprenticeships Minister, she's now the Minister for Mental Health, she was telling me on the All Talk podcast a few months ago that her family on Merseyside were all die-hard Labour voters, and they all said to her, Gillian, we're voting for Boris. We're not voting Conservative, we're voting for Boris. And you will have probably experienced the same maybe in your friendship circle as well. Maybe you're one of those people too. So it is clear that he has got an appeal. And we heard on Cross Question there where Miata thought it was a terrible speech, all over the place, no theme, she couldn't follow it. Whereas I sat there in the hall thinking, actually, this is one of his better speeches. And I don't think he's not actually been that brilliant as a platform speaker in the past. His 2019 conference speech, his first as Prime Minister, wasn't brilliant. And I've heard a few of his others at party conferences, and I wasn't impressed by any of them. And his Andrew Marr interview on Sunday, I thought was all over the place, a complete car crash in many ways. So I do not sit here and say this very lightly, but I thought it was a really good speech. I genuinely did. It was very different from any conference speeches that you hear. There was a lot more humour in it, but I didn't think he went over the top on that. I thought he set out the challenges that this nation faces over the next few years, and he gave a very good indication of what he wanted to do. Now, you can say, well, he may have done that, but he didn't tell us how, and you'd probably be right on that. But I thought that it was a really good speech, and I'm not going to be backward in saying that. And I say again, I have not been backward in my criticism of Boris Johnson over the last few years. I think in many ways he has made some very bad decisions, some terrible decisions, but I'm going to give credit where credit's due, and I liked this speech. And one of the things I really liked about it was this sense of optimism. And I don't think it was false optimism. I think that he manages to convey a positivity which few politicians, not just current politicians, but few politicians over the years have been able to do. And I go back to this point that I've made time and time and time again, that positive politicians win elections and negative politicians do not. Jeremy Corbyn, I think, was the personification of a negative politician, somebody who could see no good in this country. We were all going to hell in a handcart. And I think there's too much of that still in the Labour Party, and that is part of their problem. And people respond to positivity. Tony Blair had this in a way in 1997. Yes, he criticised the Conservatives, but he engendered people to be positive about the future of our country. Margaret Thatcher did in 1979. Believe me, she had every reason to be critical of Labour, given their record in the 1970s on the economy. But somehow she also projected a positive image where Britain had been seen as a nation in decline. And she reversed that perception, not just in this country, but all over the world. And I think that is what I want to concentrate on in this hour. Are you convinced by Boris Johnson's optimism, or do you think it is boosterism gone mad? Now, I didn't think it was over-the-top optimism. I think that's how you could define boosterism. I didn't think it was that. I thought that it was a speech which said, hang on a minute, we are a great country, we can be an even greater country, and this is what we can do to bring that about. And as I say, it was light on detail in terms of how he would do that. It was light on detail in new policies. Should we always expect a conference speech to have new policies in it? I think sometimes you need a little bit of sort of blue sky thinking, a little bit of sort of non-policy talk. I think that can go a long way. So what do you think about this? 0345 6060 973. Are you convinced by Boris Johnson's optimism, or do you think it's just a charade and he's never going to be able to live up to it? And in 2 years' time, all these red wall seats are going to be blue wall seats for the Labour Party again, just as they've been over the last 100 years generally, and that people see through him that he is the charlatan that you've always said he was. 0345 6060 973. Harry Phibbs is a journalist for Conservative Home and joins us now. Harry, apologies for my rather long monologue there. I just wonder if you would take issue with anything that I've just said there.
No, and I think the test, I suppose, would be obviously, Ian, people like us are going to be interested in the speech, but I think that any of your listeners who aren't all that political, sort of non-political people, would find it an enjoyable way to spend 45 minutes listening to that, not just because of the jokes and it being entertaining, but also the optimism is rather cheering after the difficult times we've had, and I think that's setting the bar quite high, isn't it? The idea that people who aren't that interested in politics would actually find that an enjoyable way to spend their time listening to a long political speech, and so I think the tone is important, and it's said something about his character, that he's open-minded, generous-spirited, keen on innovation, optimistic about the future. There's that sort of tone, and I think also listening to him and looking at him, you didn't feel that he was somebody who'd been sort of ground down by all the problems and was finding finding the job was getting him down. You got a sense that he was keen to keep at it, didn't you?
Yes, I think that's true. And when you think that it's only, 15, 16 months ago that he was literally on, he thought, his deathbed. And he mentioned that in his speech as well, and how the NHS came to his rescue. It is quite a turnaround, and he does